Compassion is the ultimate balance of self and selflessness. Self-awareness without self-consciousness, and transcendence of the ego. Because compassion is not compassion without boundaries, differences, distance, and a gap in understanding. The thinking of compassion is, your story is not my story, but your pain is my pain. And I don't know how you ended up in this pain, and I don't judge you for being in this pain. And I will do what I can to ease your suffering. So, the boundary of self, the difference between self and other, the wall around the edges of me as an entity, which is basically the same thing as ego. It's a construct so that we can function in the world. More on that in a moment. First ingredient is clear definitions of self, which is the material of ego. Not the same thing as ego, but the material of ego. And a transcendence of those boundaries by awareness. And an acknowledgement of unity across those boundaries. Across these differences, coexisting with these differences, and this gap is a bridge where I feel what you're going through. Empathy. Even if I don't understand it. And when I feel it, not sympathize with it, not imagine myself in your position, because that's my story. That's the story of me. We're leaving the story of me aside when we feel compassion, because it's not relevant to the suffering. And the third major ingredient is action. Compassion is not just a feeling, it's not just a thought, it's not just a theory, it's not just a construct. And that's why the ego is no match for compassion. The ego is a construct. It's a very ingenious adaptation for survival in the world and organization of this soup of energy we find ourselves in, and this soup of identity that is society. But connection means reaching across that, opening yourself up, opening up that wall, and experiencing someone else as yourself. Connection is only so really connection without empathy, without transcendence of boundaries. So there's really a very small gray area between connection and compassion. And that pretty much is suffering. and the action to reduce suffering. I don't judge you for being hungry, but I'm going to offer you food. And when we judge others for their story, it's a projection. We would judge ourselves. We do judge ourselves. And that's the only reason we judge others. So to transcend that judgment, judging yourself and judging others is a function of ego. It's a this is me, that's not me, and this is right, that's not right. These hard and inflexible boundaries, and impenetrable boundaries, that's egoism. That's competition. That's judgment. That's morality. That's projection. That's presuming to know what exists on the other side of a boundary that you yourself have defined as the limits of your own awareness. So it doesn't even make sense to project and judge. When we realize that, when we stop trying to make those two things, two contradictory things simultaneously true, that's when compassion awakens. Because we understand the boundaries we have created, we understand why and how we rely on them, what they do for us and what they don't do for us, and we go across them. We allow our awareness to go across that without the judgment. We allow the person's experience in. We open ourselves, what I call listening, receiving and organizing information. That's listening. You can listen and project at the same time. Project your own experience onto that, but it's a limit to listening. Mutually exclusive to listening. They can coexist, but not in the exact same space. So true listening almost necessarily implies empathy. Almost necessarily implies connection. Almost necessarily implies compassion. Listening is openness and striving to understand. Connection is receiving and exchanging perspective and information, allowing yourself to be changed. Empathy is feeling what you receive as if it was your own. And we don't get burned out and exhausted by that if we have the clearly defined boundaries. Inward boundaries. Not just boundaries we enforce with other people, but inward boundaries, cognitive boundaries. This does not mean anything about me. That's when we get exhausted. If we have those boundaries, the boundaries that ego uses to compete, then we can have empathy without depleting ourselves. And what we actually give to the other gives back to us, and it's a flow. It's not an expense. And when that becomes real, that's when compassion awakens, because we take action and we know it actually doesn't cost us. And this requires vulnerability. You have to open yourself to being disappointed. The person doesn't understand what all that stuff that you had to go through to get to the compassion place. But if you follow through the compassion, disappointment is not possible. Because disappointment has judgment in it, and compassion is not judgment. We are so judgmental because it's a survival tactic. Like I said, ego is a useful adaptation for surviving in the world. When we don't have good boundaries, ego is there to protect us, to create separateness. But if judgment comes with that, then we need to understand where that judgment is coming from, what it's doing for us, how it's keeping us safe, and let go of it when we don't need it anymore. When we can create real safety, inward safety. Judgment is a projection, it's an outward thing. So inward safety is compassion. And I'm hesitant to say self-compassion because it's a self-contradiction in a way, because the story of self, the story of me, is not needed if you have compassion. I think what we really mean when we say self-compassion is self-acceptance. Grace, non-judgment. And that is a part of compassion. That's why it resembles compassion. But it's then there's like the judging part of you is having compassion on the victim part of you, and that those are just roles. They're also constructs. And then when we have that inner conflict dynamic going on, we can't help but project it out onto others. I judge you because if I were in your shoes, I would do differently. But I don't if I have compassion. And if I take on your suffering to ease it. I'm willing to be vulnerable to making this sacrifice and to you receiving it in whatever way you want to. I'm vulnerable to disappointment. I'm vulnerable to perceived failure. It's actually the only sustainable way to live. Taking risks like that. It's actually not the risk of loss or disappointment or conflict. It's the risk of connection, experiencing life, sharing life with others. The risk is vulnerability. The risk is exposure. It's not a risk of loss. We don't rely entirely on each other for validation. We start with validation of ourselves. We don't rely entirely on ourselves. We need connection and community. And that requires compassion. And when we go about cultivating all these things, we build community, which is common unity. And that's a new construct, a bigger construct that keeps all of us safe. And the ego is on break, on holiday, on sabbatical, only on call in case of emergencies. Because they do happen. Internal community conflicts. But openness, listening, vulnerability, connection, empathy, compassion, community, vulnerability, expansion, resonance. We vibrate at a different frequency when we allow these things to happen. Empathetic resonance, not just sympathetic resonance. I vibe when I hear someone tells a story that reminds me of my own. Empathetic resonance, because we're willing to take that risk. The risk that the story I've invested all this in, the risk of letting go of that story and becoming a part of a bigger story. The risk of letting go of my individually defined vibration and becoming a part of a bigger, stronger vibration. Most myths and allegories and religious stories have to do with the sort of rebel or the maligned or evil character is the one who wanted its own vibration. We do need to define our individuality, but we do not need to let it define us. And when we can have it, define it, without being defined by it, that is compassion. Be exposed for what you really are, not what you project. This is why I'm not disguising my voice for this post as with effects, as I often like to do, because of what it projects and the effect that it has. This is me. We're still in a dream, but we can wake up. This is somA saying, be who we are.